that. Thank you. This is the first, welcome to the first of our Caplan Center webinars, the first of many. Jeff Shine will tell us about upcoming ones at the end of the session. So we are pleased to hear from Eric Caplan, who is Associate Professor of Contemporary Judaism and Jewish Education at McGill University in Montreal. He's the author of From Ideology to Liturgy, Reconstructionist Worship and American Liberal Judaism. And for those of you who had the pleasure of reading the first volume, I'm sure you shared with me the experience. It was like reading camp letters. I know him, I know him, I know him. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience bringing Caplanian thinking to the concrete level of our prayer book. It was first published by Hebrew Union College in 2002, and he's currently assembling an anthology of Jewish social activist thought for JPS and preparing for publication of the final volumes of the excerpts from the diaries of Mordecai Caplan, 1951 to 1978. And if I'm not mistaken, Eric, the Ideology to Liturgy is going to be republished.
Yeah, that's the context. I'll say some things about that shortly.
He's co-director with Rabbi Jeff Shine of the Mordecai M. Caplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, which is sponsoring this. So just a couple points on the structure. This is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, take your picture off. But this is being recorded. There will be two sections, one on Caplan and one on other prayer books, and a break in between each for questions and answers. Please put your questions in the chat, and Rabbi Shine, Jeff Shine, will select a few for discussion. At the end of the session at about 4:30, if you want to stay on and talk some more, you're very welcome to. We'll leave the Zoom on for a little while after that. So I think that's it. Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Jane. And it's wonderful to get an opportunity to speak to everyone and to see so many people so many people that I know. So as Jane was saying, the kind of context for this particular webinar is the fact that HUC Press has decided to reprint my book, but From Ideology to Liturgy, which I did almost 20 years ago. But because 20 years is a long time in the world of liberal liturgy, especially, and in these 20 years, all of the prayer books that I wrote on of the Reform and Conservative movement in chapter 6 of my book have been replaced. And on top of that, there's been new materials concerning Caplan that have become available, partly because the diaries are digitized now, so therefore they're easy to get your hands on, partly because my late colleague Dan Cederbaum did some work in archives and uncovered a bunch of stuff, partly because of Deborah Waxman's PhD that dealt on some of the issues that are relevant to today. So for all of these reasons, I was asked to write a basically new introduction to the book, and it's been quite a project. It's come in at about 19,000 words, and what my goal is today is to share with you just some of a taste of things that are talked about in this new preface. The book itself will be available, I think, sometime in the summer, and it'll be available either as print on demand or as an ebook, which is nice because it hasn't been an ebook beforehand. So, like Jane said, I want to divide our time into primary two pieces. The first one that is going to look at some additional things that I've learned about Mordechai Kaplan since the original book was published. And the other is to look at the new Reform and Conservative prayer books, Mishkan Tefillah and Lev Shalem, and take a look at them on a very select number of issues because we have limited time, but enough hopefully to give you a sense of some of the interesting things um, to pay attention to when you're going through these new books. So to help us make our way, I've kind of put together two resources which I'm going to be sharing with you. The first is a collection of some quotations which are in a Word document, which is the first thing that I'm going to put up. And the other is this very long collection of in a PDF of like pages from these prayer books that will have an opportunity to take a look at. So I'm going to get us going by showing you the material, the opening material here. And one of the interesting things that, looking at the list of people who are on this call, I don't think that this is news for you. Mordechai Kaplan famously said that in religion, as in everything else, we should not say what we do not mean. And that had a major impact on the impetus to go into the traditional prayer book and to change some of the formulations into ones that could better reflect what it is we do mean. And although this is for sure not the only motivating factor behind his liturgies, it is an important motivating factor. Now, obviously, it has a lot to do with just basic intellectual honesty. But I think this excerpt from the diaries that I've put up here kind of give us a little additional insight into how that issue of intellectual honesty actually played out in Kaplan's mind. And when I came across this, I felt that it was kind of more profound in a sense than I had originally perceived it when I was writing about it some 20 years ago. So as many of you know, the diaries are digitized and available through the Jewish Theological Seminary. On top of that, co-founder and board member of the Caplan Center, Mel Scalt, has been releasing excerpts from the diaries as well. This piece that I've put up here for you to look at, the first two paragraphs are not in Mel's collection, and the two paragraphs I think afterwards are in Mel's collection, right? Because these are excerpts Mel has published, like I will, excerpts from the diaries, not the complete diaries. So look at the setup here. I'm sure you've been reading a lot, as I've been setting this up for you. So if you take a look at the setup here in this first paragraph, he talks about the fact that as he's been working on liturgies, he's been targeted, or that's a strong word, but he's heard devastating criticism. Right, so Kaplan is pretty emotional in his writing, in the diaries at least, but devastating criticism is a pretty strong phrase, any way that you look at it. So October 30th, 1942, the Passover Haggadah, the new Haggadah, that's already out. So that's one major liturgical project that's in the public domain. But 1942, as we learn very strongly in the diaries, is the basic year that Kaplan really starts forging an alternative Sabbath liturgy in a significant way, as we'll see from some of these other quotes from the diaries. So this particular selection here from the end of October is the context it is of a talk that he's going to be giving at the SAJ about the changes that they have made to the liturgy. And as he's setting it up, he says himself that he's got to meet this devastating criticism. And as you see here, the devastating criticism is that Why are you, spending your time dealing with putting out new prayer books when there are clearly more, in these people's view, more pressing issues in modern Jewish life for you to deal with, right? They feel that we ought to concentrate on the more fundamental problems, like the organization of the Jewish community, increasing the demand for Jewish education, raising the ethical standards of Jewish living. And to expend effort on liturgy and ritual is to dissipate our limited energies, right? Now, there are some passages that you come across in Caplan where every sentence is like a little explosion. And in my view, this next paragraph is one of those passages, right? Because he's making all of these very, very grand and significant statements here. So to live as a Jew, he says, should mean to express oneself religiously and ethically, right? Those are for him two essential components. Now he says at the root of all religious self-expression is worship, right? So if the goal, if the essence of being a Jew is to express oneself religiously and ethically, and the root of all religious self-expression is worship, right? So that's part of the answer as to why what we pray is important. But the next part is what he continues. At the root of expressing oneself ethically is being honest with oneself, right? And this same dynamic is one that I found working with the way he approaches social justice. He's very strong believer that the first step that the Jewish community needs to take when it comes to social justice is basically to get our own house in order, right? Until our own community operates by the highest levels of social justice, until we as individuals in our private individual lives live our lives by the highest standards of social justice, it's unlikely that either the community or ourselves are going to be vehicles for making social justice. He says the same thing about, just at the micro level of ethical living. It all starts with being honest with yourself, right? If you're not honest with yourself, then you're already starting yourself off on a path that is, external to ethical living. So if we want a revolution to Jewish life, we've got to start revolutionizing our own personal lives. That calls for engaging in meaningful worship and being perfectly honest with ourselves, right? And this, I think, takes us to one of the points that Mel has been making in recent years, that we think of Caplan very much as, as concerned with the community, but he is equally concerned with the individual, right? He's equally concerned with the individual because there's not going to be a community that we want if at the individual level we are failing in different ways. Now, here's an amazing that comes next here. This is an amazing theological paragraph, I think, right? And he's talking about the essence of prayer. He says, point your mental finger, so to speak, to that which you regard as your innermost, truest, and best self. That self which is you in your most luminous moments, right? That's the self that has to be honest. Let us give it a name. Let us call it soul. For that, in fact, is what the soul actually is. Right? So, and it's out. This is like another one of these major theological leaps. Now, this soul is in all literatures a ray of the all pervading light we call God. In genuine worship, we address directly not God, but our best self, the soul within us, and ask it to communicate our thanks, our fears, our hopes, our deepest yearnings to God of whom it is part. Right? So you catch like the line here. He starts off, well, what it means to be a Jew is to be a Jew religiously and ethically. What it means to be in religious starts off with worship, right? What it means to be ethically has to start internally with our own honesty. Prayer, as he sees it, is a dialogue with our soul, and our soul is somehow part of the larger stream of being, which we call God. Now here's the punchline, right? Now we can understand where the connection between worship and being honest with oneself comes in. Since in worship we address our truest self, nothing would seem more cynical and degrading than to abuse that sacred communion by uttering words which have no meaning to that self, or expressing wishes which we do not really entertain. Right? So it's a corrupt dialogue with the self. The self is, is that part of our being that it is the truest part of who we are. It is the part that is most in tune with the divine. So we cannot lie to that part. So he says, I dare say that this is where all dishonesty begins. Once we are not honest with our best self, we find it easy to be dishonest with others. Right? So he's basically saying here, when we pray words that we don't really believe, it's a form of dishonesty, but it's not just for him a question of being intellectually honest. But he says that when you kind of accustom yourself to being dishonest, that being accustomed to being dishonest spreads. It kind of sets a way of being that sets us up both to undermine worship as a spiritual experience, and also undermining worship as a gateway to helping us live more ethically. Right? So for him, saying what we mean is a very, very major religious principle. Now, of course, all of this is predicated on the idea that the text actually means something. And, those of you who are familiar with postmodernist thought, etc., I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, and that's definitely influencing the way liturgy is being created today, as to whether the text actually has inherent meaning into it, or whether the text is a much more open vehicle to which we can, interject what, different ideas as we see fit. I'm not going to stop here because this is not new, but I just put it up here so that you have it. It'll be in part of the materials that will be posted to the website afterwards so that you can download them and keep them, right? Because Caplan believed in this honesty principle, and because he believed that texts do say something, right? He talks about there's a difference in the way we approach text. There's transvaluation and revaluation. And transvaluation is basically reading into the text whatever we want to read into it. Revaluation is kind of uncovering in the text ideas that are actually still there, right? So it's not superimposing ourselves on a text, but basically engaging with what is there. So for him, transvaluation is dishonest. Revaluation is the way to go. And he believes that his whole philosophy is basically a philosophy of revaluation. So just to close off this point before we talk more practically about Caplan's liturgy, is that we see here this question of honesty in prayer is for him part of the essence of what we need to be thinking about as Jews, because it connects to the essence of what it means to be religious. It connects to the essence of what it means to live ethically. And once we deceive ourselves in prayer, we open the gateway for deceiving ourselves in other ways. And doing so sets us outside of a path living both religiously and ethically. So, as I said, 1942 is the key year for Caplan's efforts to reform practically speaking, the Sabbath liturgy. Although as we learned from the diaries, he actually originally started thinking about doing a machzor, but then dropped it and went to the Sabbath liturgy. To me, was interesting that as you see here in this passage from October 2nd, also 1942, as he's imagining what he's going to tell the people, as he's introducing the new liturgy, he tells them, right, that basically for 20 years, we have been praying a service which virtually retained the whole of the traditional text, right? We merely eliminated the undue repetition of Kaddish, the repetition of the Amidah, right? The reader's repetition of the Amidah, and we've added some occasional prayers in English, right? So even though that's a vast improvement, he concludes that people still come to synagogue, to the SAJ, for the sermon. Nobody really finds the prayer all that meaningful because we haven't made the changes that are really required. So this is 1942. So this is 20 years after the SAJ is created. We learn basically through the diaries that, very little changes have actually been made in the liturgy. What we've had mostly are some omissions, right? So I think that's important historical information. We get more important historical information in this earlier passage, also from 1942, when he talks about the meeting of the SAJ Board of Trustees, where himself and Ira Eisenstein, after a number of meetings that they've had, managed to get the board of the SAJ to sign on to the new liturgy framework that they are suggesting. To me, it was interesting that one of the board members, right, agrees that the Musaf can be eliminated, and Caplan, in turns, backs off of his request that we only read a part of the weekly Torah portion instead of the whole Torah portion. So there's kind of a back and forth between the board members. Now take a look here at the service as they vote on it, right? So the service should begin at 10:30, which is a bit late by today's standards. Shacharit is going to last until 11 o'clock. So it's a half an hour. That's the Birchot HaShachar, Psukei Dezivra, Shema and the Brachot, the Amidah, right? All of that is in a half an hour, right? So you don't have to be a prayer leader to realize that there's a lot of omissions taking place to allow a 1/2 hour prayer service. And then he says, reading of the Torah, including some comments, is to 11:50, so that's a larger chunk than the prayer that comes before it. Sermon to 12:15, so an approximately 25-minute sermon, and some additional readings of some sort that would take us to 12:30. He then, and I included this because I won't have the time to talk about it, but I think one of the interesting things in contemporary liturgy is kind of the whole role of music in the revitalization of liturgy. But you see it already here in Caplan as he's imagining it. He says the musical rendition should be in charge of a professional choir master aided by a small choir. And emphasis is to be placed on having the service begin with a full attendance, and it's being rendered as intelligible and significant as possible, right? So that's really, that's kind of the ideal liberal paradigm, right? That you do it short, but you've got everyone there and everybody is, totally engaged. Now, I'm just going to show you one or two things from that PDF that I mentioned, and then I'm going to take the first round of questions. And I encourage you again um, to put some stuff in the chat that Jeffrey's going to gather for this first round of questions. But I'm going to put up here um, this this PDF to share with you. So one of the nifty things that I've been able to look at since 2002, when the first when the book was originally published, is when I met with Ira Eisenstein as I started to do the research for my doctorate, which then became the book. He told me that the SAJ, during the time of development of the prayer book, so in 1942, 43, were using a um, a loose leaf binder prayer book. And again, Mel Scott found a copy of this amongst the papers of Ira Eisenstein, and he photocopied it and he shared the text with me. And in the new preface, I go through it pretty closely, and I kind of say all the interesting differences between what we see here in this text, which is from 42, maybe early 43, and the one and what we see in the 1944-45 prayer book. But one of the things that caught my attention is some of the things that are not there. So take a look here. So you've got the Shema, right? You've got the Shema, and you have the first paragraph of the Shema, right, where you see here, and it's so you've got the V'ahavta paragraph here, and then you've got immediately after that you have the Tzitzit paragraph. What you don't have is the V'haya im Shamoa paragraph. Right now, the V'haya im Shamoa paragraph, right, is that paragraph that Caplan replaced in his 1945 Siddur, because it's the one that says, if you do these following things, I'm going to send rain in its season, and if you don't, I'm going to hold back rain in its season. And one of the things, that set apart Reform liturgy, let's say, from Caplan's liturgy, is that in the Reform liturgy of 1940, that passage, which they found problematic, they omitted. But in the 1945 prayer book, it's replaced, right? So another piece comes to replace it. But we see here in this SAJ liturgy, he's approaching it a lot closer to the Reform approach in not replacing it, but just omitting it. And the other thing that is just a continuation from that same page is that if you take a look at, as the Shema ends, right, after you get here, Ani Hashem Elokeichem Emet, you would normally get Emet V'yatziv, right? And you see that that's also not here. And again, that's another thing that set apart the Caplan liturgies from the 1940 Union Prayer Book, that the Union Prayer Book omitted more of these things than the Caplan Prayer Book did. But we see that at the SAJ, Caplan omitted these things, which kind of implies that somehow in the process of putting together a formal printed prayer book, he felt that some of the things that had been omitted internally to the SAJ, should be there in the printed prayer book. Now, part of it has to be probably because other than the SAJ, the other congregation that he knew for a fact was going to buy it was the Park Avenue congregation, Milton Steinberg's congregation. And Rabbi Steinberg, for sure, would not have been happy not to see the Emet Vayetziv, not to have some sort of replacement for the second paragraph of the Shema. So I think that was probably an element to it. But seeing this text and seeing, some things omitted that, that it never dawned on me that Caplan would omit, opens up the question as to whether the 1945 prayer book is a complete representation of the way he was thinking about liturgy at the time, or whether there's some sort of compromises taking place that are leading to the text being as the text is. So that's in terms of that. I don't have time to talk to you about the Musaf, but one thing which you can find in the diary, so I gave this to you and from the diaries itself instead of typing it out for you or giving the piece from Mel's excerpt from this, because this is such a historically significant thing. So I wanted you to see the original. So you see this is Friday, November 15th, 1935. And it's a relatively short entrant in the diaries talking about different things. And here in the part that I just sandwiched here in black, he writes, in a newspaper clipping I received this morning, I note that Louis I. Newman has broadcasted the change I have made in the benediction before the reading in the Torah, where instead of Mikol Amim, right, instead of chosenness from amongst all people, I say le'avodato. Right? The first time I recited the benediction in the change form was on Yom Kippur, when I was called to Maftir Yonah, right? So Yom Kippur would be September, October, and he's writing now in November. He says, before reciting it, I explained to the congregation the reason for the change. I had spoken on that reason in the sermon last Shabbat. So one of the things that we can get in the diaries is a bit of an insight, as you see, into the historical development of that of the 45 prayer book, and part of that has to do with being able to look at these type of excerpts where he kind of says, this is when I started saying this particular thing. So even though the major formal change to the liturgy did not come until 1942, which is when the SAJ gets agrees to a liturgy that is much changed from the relatively speaking from the traditional liturgy. We can see that Caplan himself started making some for himself substitutions earlier than that. And the reason why I chose this particular one is because till this day, the Reconstructionist approach to chosenness is one of our defining characteristics, because the contemporary reform and conservative liturgy have chosenness in it, and they always did, right? While Kol Neshama only has it as a choice in the Torah blessing, and that's only to accommodate people coming from who are outside of the synagogue who might get messed up, not seeing the formulation that they have. And there's a note there which is basically has a little skull and crossbones next to it, basically saying like use at your own peril. So this, in terms of a textual change, the Reconstructionist, approach, liturgical approach to chosenness is one of the defining characteristics of Reconstructionist liturgy. And as we can see here, Caplan comes to it relatively early. In 1935, he's already making this change. So I'm going to stop talking and turn things over to stop the share. Turn things over to Jeffrey, who can share some questions, comments from the chat.
Sure, I'm glad to. I have 6 that I noted. One was something that Rabbi Karl Chopper picked up, that in the prayer, we're used to seeing the Torah blessing change to avodato, draw us near in service. But Carl noted that in the SAJ service, it's also mikarev et amo v'shalom, that instead of habocher, instead of choosing, it's drawing near to service. And I never knew that was a change. I never knew the Ahava Rabbah was part of that change.
Yes.
Susan Schnorr wanted to know, Eric, whether at any point in these changes, their lay people at SAJ had a voice about whether things were replaced or eliminated from the service. Maybe Mel could show us in sign language too.
Yeah, well, yeah, Mel talked about it in Mel has talked about it in the first biography that in his biography of Caplan, but Ira spoke a lot to me about it as well, and you also see it in Caplan's writings. But there's also this wonderful article that Ira Eisenstein wrote about Caplan as liturgist in this collection of articles that came out of a conference on Caplan, and that was published in the early 1990s. And in it, he kind of reconstructs the whole conversation surrounding the changes that Caplan wanted to make in the Kol Nidre. And Caplan, made pretty substantial changes in the Kol Nidre, at which he finds himself being attacked by his in-laws and he's getting it from all sides. And in the end, the thing that really tips the scales for him is the fact that Ira Eisenstein's grandfather shares with him an understanding of the Kol Nidre that kind of makes it a little bit more acceptable to him. So I think that when Caplan talks about lay involvement in major religious decisions, he usually will add to that he thinks that the lay people who should be involved in these decisions are people who are knowledgeable. In other words, to sit, with rabbis talking about changes that need to be made, you have to be coming not only from lived experience, but from a deep well of Jewish knowledge. Practically speaking, these liturgies were not created in conversation with lay members of the SAJ beyond what we see as the back and forth with the board of trustees, as I showed you an example as an example of. And it's also a question of how concerned they were about these things. I don't think that this was a primary concern in terms of a wording here or a wording or a wording there. And as we've kind of learned again from looking at both the diaries and letters, Caplan paid a tremendously high price, for example, for his approach to chosenness in the Haggadah. And yet he was steadfast about it. So I think that on major ideological changes, he could not be moved all that easily.
Thanks, Eric. I'll give a number of things back and then you can comment on them as a group or individually. Jonah was curious about why there's no explicit mention of the role of the Shliach Tzibor here and what we're looking at. That's a question that he had. Lainey Bergman noted, and here I'm looking at Hillel Cohn, who was the first one to share with me the Reconstructionist statement of the 13 wants of the Jewish community. She remembers in Brooklyn, when she joined her first Reconstructionist community, that it was underscored that of the 13, the most central principle was being a community that was yosher, that was honest with itself. We had a musing from the Greek family.
No, yeah. It's a conservative synagogue, and they omitted that That's the principle they omitted. They had
Oh,
12 and they omitted that one, which gave us a good chuckle.
rather telling. Thanks. Someone wanted to know if we think of prayer as aspirational, is its function to confirm what we already do well? Is that the nature of the aspiration? Or is it to challenge us to change our behaviors? Is a question that came to us. And someone wanted to know if these changes that happen in the liturgy could also happen in the Torah text, as in changing in the Vahafta, Livanecha, Livanotecha. So there are some more questions and observations for you, Eric.
Quickly, like Caplan changes some of the, when it comes to passages to be read from the Torah on holidays, Caplan makes some changes and chooses ones that occasionally that he feels are more edifying and more religiously.
Eric, we're
More,
not, okay. Can you go back? Because we lost you for just a little bit.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm saying that in terms of Torah readings, the only Torah readings that Caplan changed were the ones for holidays, where for the holidays he switched out some of them, but he kept the flow of the weekly readings. Although we have a lot of places in which he basically thinks that that's a mistake. But practically speaking, he himself, as a rabbi, didn't make that change. In terms of Kaplan was very concerned about, the chazanut element, and in fact, to get a good sense of that, the SAJ, as part of its centennial, is running a program in January, at the end of January, on the music and chazanut of the SAJ. And if you want to get a sense of the kind of changes, what the services were like from a musical standpoint, that's going to be, I think, a good place for you, for you to take a look. So let me shift now to just to give you a taste of some of the things that I think are interesting when it comes to this next round of prayer books. So, as you know, Kol Shema, the first kind of trial test volume, comes out in 1989. And then Shabbat v'Chagim, the Sabbath and Festival book, is in 1994, if I remember correctly. The daily prayer book is 1996, and the Machzor is 1999. So when I was working on From Ideology to Liturgy, and my doctorate for that matter, well, From Ideology to Liturgy, I had all of the Kol Neshama volumes that I could work with. At that time, the conservative movement had Sim Shalom, which they had put out in 1985. The movement wasn't very happy with it. For a lot of reasons, people found it unusable and bulky, and there was all kinds of questions about the translation, especially when it comes to gender neutrality. So in 1998, they published a portion of Sim Shalom in an updated form. But they already knew that they were going to have to go further and redo that prayer book. That prayer book, Sim Shalom, even though it has a lot of stuff that I think movement members found compelling, did not change, it did not age well. So the conservative movement put out a new Machzor in 2011 and followed relatively quickly in 2016 with the Sabbath and Festival prayer book. They still haven't done a new daily prayer book. The Reform movement, answering, I guess, to some of the same tensions, right? Gates of Prayer had come out in 1975, and they put out a gender-sensitive version of some of the services in the early 1990s, but they too realized that they had to go further, and they engaged in a very, very long process that I write about in the new preface that culminated with putting out Mishkan Tefillah in 2005, 2006, and which is a daily Sabbath and festival prayer book, and a Machzor afterwards published in 2 volumes, but simultaneously in 2 volumes, which came out in 2015. So like I said, I didn't have access to either of these new liturgies when I was writing my book, but Peter Nobel, who unfortunately has passed away in a couple of years ago, he was the head of the prayer book commission that was going to be overseeing for the Central Conference of American Rabbis the new liturgy, and he shared with me a number of materials, and I had a whole exchange with him. So in the footnotes to chapter 6 of my book, I was able to kind of say some things about what the new Reformed prayer book was likely to actually look like. As is often the case, some of the things proved to be true and some of the things did not prove to be true. And that's one of the things that I show in the preface. But the conservative process, even though I had exchanges with Ed Feld, who was the editor of it, it was at such an early stage that there really wasn't anything that I could put from that and that I can include into the book. So what I want us to do here, there's an interesting way, I think, of looking at these prayer books that just concentrates on each page and what you find there, right? Before we kind of talk about, the actual text, right? So I'm going to do another screen share. Go back to that same PDF that I shared with you, before. So the first thing that I'm going to start off with Kol HaNeshama, right? Because it comes out earlier, and as you're going to see here, I think Kol HaNeshama set the tone for what should be included in a liberal Jewish prayer book, right? It set the tone in the sense that what Reform and conservative Judaism did was basically bring in these same elements, but they approach these elements very differently, as I'll show you. So if you take a look here, a couple of the things that are interesting. So one thing is you've got transliteration, right? Kol HaNeshama does not provide a complete transliteration, but it transliterates a decent amount of the text so that if a person is coming to synagogue and cannot read the Hebrew, they can still pray in Hebrew, right? At least vocalize these particular words. You have at the bottom of the text here, you have footers that kind of tell you where you are. So again, if you're somebody who is not, 100% conversant in the prayer service, and you're told open up to page 140, right? And you can't just look at the prayer and have on your own like a really good sense of like where are you within the flow of the service. So Kol HaNeshama helped people out by giving those footers. It also, as you see here, gives kind of stage directions, right, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, etc. Looking at the facing page, you get an English translation. The English translation in Kol HaNeshama is a poetic translation, but it is, for the most part, accurate. right? And at the time, this was one of the things that set apart Reconstructionist and conservative liturgy. The conservative liturgy often did not give an accurate English translation. As we'll see, that's not the case anymore. And perhaps most significantly is the commentaries on the bottom of the pages, right? This is really something that has had, I think, a great impact on liberal liturgy. One of the commentators is on this very call, David Teutsch, right? The bottom comment here. And we'll get back to it in a second. Right, so as you see here, you've got the Hebrew text, you've got footers, you've got transliteration, you've got commentary, you've got stage directions, very clear stage directions. You also have an aesthetically pleasing page, right? Now, let's take a look now at the conservative prayer book. The reason why I had to put it up this way is to get a full sense of, you know, they also work with a 2-page spread. They're also working with a 2-page spread. Now, let's start off with this side. So again, you've got your stage directions. We're not going to talk about how the different prayer books respond to feminism, although I do in the new preface. It's an interesting point, but you can see already something here on the page that's relevant to that. So you've got your Hebrew text. You've got on the page facing it, you have the English translation. So that's kind of similar to the way Kol Neshama does the formatting. The English text is pretty accurate. There's only one area where there's uniformity of it not being accurate, which is on chosenness. And if we have the time, I'll show you what that looks like. You have also at the bottom of the pages, you've got those footers that I told you about, that I showed you in Kol Neshama. You've got footers here as well. They're a little bit different than the footers in Kol Neshama, but they serve the same basic purpose. Instead of having commentary on the bottom, as you see in Kol Neshama, what they do is they have the commentary on the right-hand page. The commentary itself is has a bit of a unique element to it. It is more historical than either the commentary in Kol Neshama or the commentary in Mishkan Tefillah, the Reform Prayer Book, right? I chose this particular page because I want us to talk about Mechayei Meitim, you know, who gives life to the dead. So we're going to come back to that in a second. So it's not representative necessarily of the difference in the commentaries, that you're going to have to trust me on this. The commentary in the conservative prayer book is really kind of this combination of very scholarly commentary and very kind of more spiritual, inspirational commentary. While there is some historical commentary in Kol Neshama, there is much more kind of spiritual type commentary. In the Reform Prayer Book, they've kind of transferred most of their historical background to a separate volume, which they've published separately for each one of the prayer books. So for Mishkan Tefillah, there's another book called Divrei Mishkan Tefillah, which gives all the detail about all the changes and places them all in a very broad historical context. Shifting to the other side, what they put here is usually poetry or, you know, some sort of other type of reading, right? So there is transliteration in this Siddur as well, but they made the decision only to transliterate parts of the service which are uniformly sung out loud in all congregations. So you don't see it on this page, but you will see it in some of the other pages that I will show you. So once again, you've got your English, you've got your Hebrew, and the English is quite accurate. You've got your stage directions, you've got your footers, you've got your commentary, right? So even though the page looks quite different than Kol Neshama, I want to suggest to you that I think Kol Neshama is influencing this page. Now, switching to Mishkan Tefillah, the book is really very broad. The pages are very broad, so I had to give it to you in 2 pages to give you a sense of it. And again, give a little plug. The Reform movement sells its prayer books in Kindle versions, and they're only $10 each. So if you're interested, that's what I'm showing you here. And what's nice is, any of you guys use the Kindle, you know that the formatting can often be very different than the formatting of the printed book. Here, the Kindle versions of the prayer books are formatted exactly like the actual book is. There's no change into the formatting. So here what you've got, take a look, you've got you've got the same elements. You've got your Hebrew. Here you have an extensive transliteration, right? You've got word for word transliteration. And that's because if you compare Reform and Conservative, data shows there's higher levels of Hebrew fluency in conservative congregations over Reform ones. So that is impacting it. You've got instead of a footer, you've got here instead on the side, it tells you exactly where you are, right? So here you've got a listing of the blessings of the Amidah, and it tells you exactly which, because this is Shabbat morning, which of the 7 blessings you're looking at. You've got underneath it, you've got the English translation. You've got the eulogy, the Chatima here. And here's something different, right? Here you get a reading, and you get it in the center of the page. And as in the other prayer books, you've got commentary, but here the commentary is kind of placed like you see in Kol Neshama. The commentary is at the bottom of the page. Now, the Mishkan Tefillah is a much more open liturgy visually, right? As you see here, because the conservative prayer book has quite a lot of text in both margins, the margins on the left-hand page and the margin on the right-hand page. This book is a bit more open so it's closer to Kol Neshama, which is a heavy book in the sense that it's like 800 some odd pages, the Shabbat V'Chagim version, but there's a lot of open space. This too has quite a lot of open space. Now, I want to suggest to you that in addition to the difference in the commentary, the way these books are formatted is making a major, major, major point, right? So let's take a look here. We're at Mishkan Tefillah. Mishkan Tefillah, right, it gave you the traditional prayer over here with the transliteration. It gave you the English, and it gives you the Chatima here. But notice you've got a number of Chatimot, a number of eulogies to the blessing, right? You've got the one that comes at the end of the Hebrew here, right? You've got the one that comes at the end of the English translation. And in this reading that they are offering, they give you also a Chatima. In this case, it's not the Chatima from the traditional liturgy, it's a replacement Chatima, but I just wanted to show you that in the Machzor, which comes out afterwards, the alternative that they give you has the same chatima as the Hebrew that they use, right? So that gets changed somewhat. Now, why am I harping on this, right? Let's go back to our conservative liturgy, and I'm sorry for all the scrolling. I hope it's not making you nauseous. There's a deliberate statement being made here. If you are a prayer leader, in the center of the page, like in the core text that you're holding, you've got a lot of commentary, right? You've got your English and you've got, right? But any readings or, or a potential, something that you might want to use, within the service gets put to the side. So there's a message that comes from this formatting, I think. And the message is that this is the liturgy that's in the center here. That's the liturgy that we pray. Now, you might want to add something from the side of the page, and you may want to put it, as something that sheds light. You may want to read it, encourage members to read it. You may want to read it out loud before you do the other liturgy. But it's not set up in a way that it is meant to telegraph that it is a potential replacement for the core text, the core liturgical text. But turning to, now, I'll just say as a quick aside, in the conservative prayer book, there are a couple of pages that are marked as alternatives. So they give, for example, for Shmini Atzeret and for Passover, the special prayers that have to be said for dew and rain, they give you one version as an Ashkenazi version, and they write alternate version, a Sephardi version. In the Friday evening service, for some of the blessings, they have on a separate page versions of these blessings as taken from the Italian rite. So there are a couple of places where they give clear alternates to be used by worshipers and prayer leaders. But for the most part, they're setting up the alternative material in a way that is meant to kind of shed light on the core material. They're not setting it up as something that is likely to replace it, right? Just in the typesetting. But when you switch to Mishkan Tefillah, you see that they give you the Hebrew Chatima for the English. And they give you the Hebrew Chatima for the alternative that they're giving you on the opposite page. And they're placing it in the center of a page. And as they write in the introductions to the prayer books, they are doing this to set it up in such a way that one prayer leader might choose, to do this instead. One prayer leader might choose to do the Hebrew instead. One prayer leader might decide to do the English instead. Conversely, you as a prayer person might decide that you would rather just read this. You're not paying attention to the Hebrew. How do you know that the prayer is finished? Well, you hear the Chatima, you hear the eulogy. So then you know that you're meant to turn the page, right? So I think that the Reform movement is less troubled with the idea that core texts of the inherited liturgy may not be recited by a particular congregation, either on a continuous basis or just, this particular week or another week, or that it might be switched up. And they format the prayer book to allow for that. The conservative movement, I think, is not setting up their prayer book to facilitate congregants, taking this passage from Solomon Ibn Gvirol and using it as an alternative version of the Gvurot blessing. They don't give you a chatima. They put it on onto the side. Now, let's take a look. Oh, okay, so because of the time, I'm going to not actually talk about Michayim 18 because I only have about another 10 minutes. So instead, I'm going to flip ahead and I'm going to show you the second paragraph of the Shema, which we already talked about in the Caplan part. And I'm just going to, again, I apologize for all the scrolling, all the scrolling around. So again, we start off by looking at Kol Neshama. One of the interesting innovations or changes of Kol Neshama in relation to the Caplan prayer books is that the second paragraph of the Shema is returned as a choice, as biblical selection number 2, right? So that congregations that choose to do it have the text, right? Which they didn't have in the Caplan prayer book. If you take a look, you see that the commentary points out the fact that that the original Reconstructionist prayer books omitted this this text. So there's kind of putting it in that particular historical context. How can we account for the fact that this text gets put in? Well, I think there's a whole question of to what extent the liturgy, as Caplan said, has to reflect exactly what we mean. And that is something that I think is a dynamic in all the new liturgies, including Kol Neshama, even though it's not that, although it's not that new. But a definitive element here is the interpretation that's given, right? There is such a thing as some passages might speak to a particular moment in a very significant way and therefore become compelling. And the idea that we leave them out is more problematic than it was, beforehand. And Mordechai Liebling, who many of us know, is the person who wrote this particular commentary, right? So I guess I'm assuming that you guys know this text, and so just to put it up here for those who don't know it that fluently, right? As I said here, if you truly listen to my bidding, God is saying, and you do these various different things, then I will give you rain upon your land in its appointed time, the early rain and the later rain, so that you may gather in your corn. And I will give you grass upon your field and to feed your animals, etc. But beware then, lest your heart be led astray, and you go off and worship other gods, and you submit to them, so that the anger of the Almighty One shall burn against you. And then God will seal up the heavens so rain will not fall, etc. Now, notice Mordechai's commentary here. He says, this warning against idolatry has ecological significance. If we continue to pollute the environment and thus display contempt for the integrity of God's creation, pure rain will cease to fall and the ground will cease to give forth its produce. Right? So, as a whole, Kol Neshama, the verses about reward and punishment that are in the Yigdal are still omitted in the way that they were omitted in Caplan's prayer book. But this passage is given as choice, right? And one of the reasons is because the generation who puts together this prayer book can see a meaning in this passage that is compelling and significant, right? Now, is Mordechai's reading, is it a transvaluation or a revaluation? That's an interesting a question that we can perhaps talk about in a few minutes. Now, if you take a look at what happens in the other liturgies about this, right? So one of the things that continues to define conservative liturgy is the fact that it very rarely changes the Hebrew text. It used to kind of use the English text as a way of dealing with passages which it considered theologically problematic. But one of the things that is new in the new conservative liturgies is that the English translation is, with very few exceptions, accurate. So the way that they are dealing with some of the same theological problems that anybody might see in this second paragraph of the Shema is through a combination of the commentary and readings that are given. So if you see here, so we're going to take a look at a few examples. In this version of it, they talk about, that it's been a source of theological struggle for every Jewish generation, including of the biblical era itself, and many Reform and some Reconstructionist congregations omit this paragraph. Now, notice what they then do. While our life experience often belies a belief in direct and immediate reward and punishment, in reciting this passage, we may open ourselves to the suggestion that the consequences of our moral and immoral behavior resound in the world, though in ways that we may not grasp and that are beyond our comprehension. Right? So again, trying to set up, what the message could be here that could resonate with moderns. It's actually not that different than Art Green's comment in Kol Neshama on the same passage that is in the text, but that we didn't see. If, however, you take a look at the other side of the column, you see a couple of things here that are interesting. One is you see that the same interpretive version that was included in the Friday night Siddur Sim Shalom gets included here on the side here as an interpretive translation. What's interesting about Rabbi Unger's version here is that it takes out that kind of quid pro quo element in the same kind of way that it appears in the text from Deuteronomy. The most kind of crafty thing I think that they do here is with this quote here from Abraham Joshua Heschel. And as an aside, I'll say that the two most quoted personalities in the Reform and in the conservative new prayer books are Heschel. So that means both in the Reform book and the conservative book, even though Heschel worked for the conservative movement, Heschel is one of the most quoted people, and the other is Yehuda Amichai, right? And Amichai, those of you who pray from Kol Neshama know that Amichai figures prominently in Kol Neshama as well. What Heschel's passage here is doing is it's trying to come up with the idea, it's trying to deal with this question of God as an angry God, right? Because the text says, then Adonai's anger will flare up against you, right? A very personal human kind of vision of God. He sees you doing these things and God suddenly gets angry, right? So the passage here from Heschel is aimed specifically at this idea that God gets angry. And he basically says, we're talking here about, the prophets never thought that God's anger is something that could not be accounted for. Unpredictable, irrational. It is never a spontaneous outburst, but a reaction occasioned by the conduct of man, right? So Heschel is saying that God gets angry when people behave in such a way, not ritually, but morally, that makes God angry. And in that sense, this is kind of a positive, theological take on God's anger. God's anger comes from a deep moral well that we should all feel actually very comfortable with, right? Now, of course, this passage has nothing to do in its origin with the second passage of the Shema, in which it's not so clear that what's being talked about are moral transgressions. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the conservative Mahzor, what's interesting is that you see that now the commentary that they give puts forth the exact same type of ecological commentary that Mordechai includes in Kol Neshama, right? And when you go now to the Reform Prayer Book, you see kind of an interesting difference. In the daily prayer book, they don't have the second paragraph of, in the Shabbat Festival prayer book, they don't give you the second paragraph of the Shema. But when you read carefully, you see that the alternative text that faces it, which is written by Rabbi Richard Levy, is basically a dialogue with that passage. And the dialogue is one, again, that is very similar in tone to what Art Green writes in the commentary of Kol Neshama. Switching, however, to the Mahzor, we see that in the Mahzor, that second paragraph of the Shema is back, translated accurately, but as a choice, right? So it's not, that's why it's in this grayish background. It's back as a choice. And if you take a look here at the translation, at the commentary is once again emphasizing ecological consciousness. Now, if you look, so what the point I was trying to make here is that I think we can see Kol Neshama. First of all, I think the components of what a prayer book, a liberal prayer book today should have, you can see echoes of that in these other liturgies, and I think there's an influence coming there. But we can also see that whether you're a Reconstructionist, you're a conservative Jew, or you're a Reformed Jew, you're living in the same universe. You're dealing with the same basic questions, and it's not surprising that an interpretation that gets first introduced, from a print and a date standpoint in the Reconstructionist prayer book, lands up also finding its way into the conservative prayer book and into the Reformed prayer book, because there's a commonality of experience, and all of these kind of serves to kind of redeem passages that perhaps were problematic to previous generations, but are less problematic for us today for a variety of reasons. And the final thing that I just want to show you, and again, I apologize, we're going to do something on the prayer for the state of Israel, which would have been interesting, but we don't have time for that. But one thing that I did want to point out before I turn this over is there's only one area where the text of Kol Neshama feels somewhat dated, and that's in the response to non-binary individuals, right? Kol Neshama was ahead of the curve when it came to considering same-sex couples, right? And it provided blessings for life cycle moments that could be recited by same-sex couples. But it didn't have a conception of people who do not identify with a particular gender, right? It didn't provide text that enabled them to do so. Here, if we take a look at the Reformed liturgy of the Mahzor, we see that they give you a version of the blessing that can be recited by somebody who doesn't want to identify with one gender over the other. And the phrasing that they use here is mi beit, instead of blank ben and ben the son of or the daughter of, it's from the house of. Now, the conservative movement doesn't do that in their liturgy, but what I wanted to show you was that they published their final liturgy in 2016. This is from a response of the Committee on Jewish Law of the Conservative Movement from 2017 that passed with 11 in favor and 8 abstentions, nobody voting against it, in which they call for the creation of such liturgies that also refer, that are usable by people who don't want to identify as man or woman. So these are existing. This is not going to be a point of differentiation. Any of you guys who hang out at Ritual Well know that Ritual Well, which is a project of the Reconstructionist movement, has many, many versions of blessings of this type that also are, to use this this heading, queered. So all of this to say is that we can see it in print in the Reformed liturgies, but the formulations are out there. So even if you don't have them in print, you can access them and you can add them. And in that sense, I think this shift, what I've tried to show, I hope I've been able to show it. I called the book From Ideology to Liturgy. I think that movement still exists. We can still see that movements are crafting their liturgies with their ideologies in mind, and that having a prayer book that responds to that ideology is an essential piece. But what's also an essential piece is having a book that is well used and well usable. So I know from my extensive interviews with the people who created Kol HaNeshama, they spent a lot of time thinking about how the book was formatted. And as you can see here, the Reform and the Conservative movement have equally spent a lot of time considering how these books are formatted. So I'm going to open it up now for questions. I apologize that we didn't get to look at even half of the amount of material that I originally had planned to show you, but hopefully you nonetheless have gotten a sense of some of these things. And like I said, all of this material will be in the new preface, which you'll be able to access for yourself.
Eric,
Jeffrey,
do you want to take questions directly? You want me to provide a very quick summary of the transcript of comments? What's your pleasure? One comment I got was to be sure to pass on to you by someone who had to leave how much they enjoyed this session and how stimulating it was. So I'm Yotze there. Do you want to take questions directly, or do you want me to give a quick summary?
You could summarize and
okay.
We can move from there.
Rabbi David Teutsch clarified for us that there is a principle behind transliteration, that the sections are translated, the sections that would be sung, and that was also mentioned about Leiv Shalem. That was something that guided it. There was an interesting machloket that came up, I think it was Jonah Mendelsohn who said, you know, the Siddur is like these adventure books that I used to read as a child, where you can choose your own pathway. And arguing with that a bit was Miriam Eisenstein, who, b'shem her father, Ira, said that he found it very difficult to have a Chinese menu approach to prayer that got in the way of things rather than help things. There was a couple comments on the side about the role of aesthetics and the fine work that Betsy Teutsch has done for us in introducing that in Kol HaNeshama. I don't see that replicated in other Siddurim. I think it is Hidur Mitzvah.
Well, I'll interrupt you for a second. Just say the Reform Machzor has artwork, and they commissioned somebody to create. They commissioned somebody to do print artwork for the Machzor. So every section of the Machzor has some sort of artwork that introduces it. And also the way Kol HaNeshama takes the Shema and puts it on 2 pages and puts aesthetics, drawings next to it is also what you can see in Mishkan. In Mishkan Tefillah, in the Reform prayer book too. So some of that aesthetic sensibility is in the other prayer books as well.
Rabbi Bob Tabak mentions that Lev Shalem seems to have, the conservative prayer books, a sensitivity to women's voices. And if you look at the side columns, you can often hear those voices echoing there. Rabbi Larry Pinsker said that if he thinks about these prayer book projects, he thinks Kol HaNeshama is vitamin enrichment for those people who need enriched prayer experience, and perhaps the Mishkan Shalom is for people who are traumatized by prayer and would rather get outside of the prayer experience or find a shortcut. And someone mentioned that when they studied with Rabbi Caplan, he indicated that he was looking forward to a time when the new insights of psychology and anthropology would become a core of the prayer text itself and replace many of the older prayers. That's the stream of comments that we have here.
Fantastic. So
you're missing mine, actually,
Please,
Jeff.
go ahead,
Oops.
Catherine.
It's Joan. And okay,
Joan.
I have it there. Would you like to summarize, or you want me to do it?
No, please. We're moving into more active dialogue. So,
All right, just from a practical standpoint, and as someone who's actually disabled, and as one of many who are getting older, while I love Kol HaNeshama on many levels, it is very heavy to hold. And I expect that's true for Betty. I've heard this comment from others. So I want to bring that up because it's a problem that I don't know how to rectify. There's so much about Kol HaNeshama I like, and the larger print makes it easier to read. But these are practical issues that I think need to be addressed.
yeah, well, it's interesting. Like one of the things that you'll see when you get the full text of all the sources that I gathered for today, you'll see that the one of the things that I put there is a transcript from a conference that the Caplan Center did with Mechon Hadar when it was still called Mechon Hadar in 2015, and it was a panel discussion on the future, on movement liturgies and the future of movement liturgies, and it was with Jan Orbach, who was a co-editor of the conservative liturgy, Rena Spicehandler, who was part of the editorial group of the Kol Neshama liturgies, and Peter Nobel, who, as I mentioned beforehand, was one of the people spearheading the Reform liturgies, and they get into a conversation there about the use of technology. And Rena Spicehandler, her point that she makes is very similar to what you were saying, Joan. That she says, as she gets older, she finds Kol Neshama to be heavy, and she also finds the print seem to be getting smaller and smaller. So the idea of having a tablet-based prayer book is very attractive to her. Now, the Reform movement released Mishkan Tefillah originally as a tablet app. That was one of the ways that you could use it. But then the three rabbis are basically get into a discussion about the convenience of an electronic text versus the aesthetic of an electronic text, and they kind of feel, the Reform and the conservative liturgists feel that the aesthetic is all wrong in a tablet, while Rena says, I see the point that you're making, but this is a very heavy book. So I have a feeling that as these questions move forward, in the next generations, these are some of the things. Like Rita makes a good point. She says the next generation might not get the same aesthetic pleasure from the print book as we do, but they may really appreciate the flexibility of a technology.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, was there something else that came through?
Well, just my puzzlement and interest in why you render Chatima, which I usually call a closing, as a eulogy. There's probably something there, Eric. Can you say more?
Well, yeah. Well, those of you who know me know that when I wrote the book originally, I was not a professor of liturgy, and I'm not a professor of liturgy now. I'm a professor of contemporary Judaism, and I was looking at the liturgy as a gateway into contemporary Judaism. So the HUC Press were very helpful, and they had Rick Saracen, who is a professor of liturgy, work on the book with me. And make sure that I used all the correct terminology. I didn't call prayers by the wrong names, and and stuff like that. So eulogy comes from him. He said that that's the technical term that is used in academia to talk about Khatima.
Well, I think that's very wrong, but that's another discussion.
All right. So there's more comments coming, but we're now in overtime. So as I said, everything that I didn't get to is going to be in the new preface that you'll be able to have access to, at some point in the summer. But I'm going to put up both the PDF that I showed you and the Word document. And you'll be able to play around with it as well. Take a look at the different versions of the Prayer for the State of Israel that I have there. I've given the original one, the one in Kol Neshama, 2 versions of it in the Reformed Prayer Book, because they do it a bit differently in the Machzor than from the Sabbath Prayer Book, and the one in Lev Shalem. And take a look and see if you can see what the points of difference are. They're very, very interesting. And it's a good gateway into how liberal Jews interact with Israel in our time. So what I suggest is Jeffrey's going to say now a couple of things about the upcoming webinars. And for those of you who want to continue the dialogue about this material, I'm happy to stay on here for a little bit longer, and everyone can unmute, and we can have an open dialogue about the things that I said, the things that I didn't say. I'm not in a rush to shut this session off. So let me turn things off to Jeffrey. If you have to leave, I just want to thank you for being here, and so many comments in the chat. And I see Marcia Falk has joined us, and I just want to point out an interesting thing for me in the conservative liturgies is if you take a look at that, the left page in the margin, you see that they have a number of Marcia's formulations that they've included there.
Can I say something, Eric?
Sure.
First of all, this was brilliant, wonderful. Wish I'd had it 30 years ago. Your remarks, you laid it out brilliantly. So I thank you. I've been here since the beginning, by the way. I got out of my doctor's appointment early, but the very last comments by Joan and Catherine about accessibility. Too often, I think that both the Reform and the conservative Sidurim were edited, and perhaps the design was made by Jews who knew that these books are to be davened from and need to be legible in places that might not have bright light. Like synagogues are not always the best places for reading. And I'm saying this kind of as a warning to other people who are working on liturgy. See if you can make sure that your producers of the books understand that you can't have tiny print for your Sidurim. It's not even like reading a book with reading glasses. You need to have it really accessible out there. I'm really sorry to admit that my high holiday Machzor, I fought that battle and lost, and the print in it is too small for me. I have to, when I give readings, read enlarged photocopies, which is bizarre. But it may seem like a detail, but I am so glad that Joan and Catherine brought this up, and that in the issue of design and aesthetics, this will, and aesthetics may contradict this issue because may, need to readjust how the pages sign up. Sorry to take that much time.
That's okay. There might be
Thank you,
intention. So I hope people will stay on. Dahlia Marks is with us, and Dahlia, if you can stay on, I know you are the one of the editors of the new Reform Israeli Siddur, and I think you may have some perspective to offer as well in that regard. So again, people are invited to stay on for a more open dialogue. I'd like you to get excited about what's coming up in the next several months regarding in our
Jeff, you're muted.
No, I'm not muted, but I'm not. Here you go. For those of you who enjoyed this webinar, which I certainly did, stay tuned because we have 3 webinars coming up in January and February that build off of a major focus of Caplan Center spiritual intellectual work of last year. One was exploring deeply the issue of religious naturalism. That was a conference. The other was the publication of a volume, Lifelong Spirituality and God Connection. And both those issues are worthy of so much more exploration. So I'm delighted that on January 9th, our next webinar, the time may change because we didn't know whether Rabbi Michael Cohen would be in Israel or here. We might make it a little earlier in the day. I'm sure our Israeli participants will appreciate that. But they've written over the last 7 years 2 important volumes that we're going to bring to surface for a dialogue. Roger Price's more recent one, When Judaism Meets Science, and Rabbi Michael Cohen's Einstein's Rabbi. I was on with them today and we were discussing the issues that it raises about the relationship of religion and science, humans and God and the divine. And they are so much a part of the Kaplanian enterprise that we're delighted that they will be in dialogue on January 9th. Keeping with that theme, at the end of the month, on January 30th, my colleague, Rabbi Aaron Hirsch, who works with us at the Caplan Center, became an enormous fan of a new volume published a year ago by Sasha Sager, the daughter of Carl Sagan. Called For Small Creatures Such as We, and she will be joined by Rabbi Sandy Sasso and Dr. Zemach Yore in an exploration of what that book says about the access that we give people to the divine and making God language and God experience so central in our lives. It should be very, very rich. And at the end of February, as we begin to think about Purim, we have invited 3 folks, one of them is on the call with us, who think about the issues of the human and divine in different interesting ways to come together and to help us explore the figure of the golem in Jewish life and how it mediates the supernatural, the natural, the human and divine. And those 3 people are Rabbi Lawrence Pinsker, who has been teaching for many years about science fiction, Jewish science fiction, Dr. Henry Morris, who is a professor of augmented intelligence and raises issues, and my own work in the personal side of ethics in a digital age. They will be in dialogue with one another. So you'll get an opportunity to sign up for them as a group or individually, but we wanted you to know that that was coming your way and makes for a very exciting set of webinars, we hope, come January. And of course, peek beyond that a little bit, and you'll have a chance on, I believe it's March 13th, to be with Marcia Falk and explore her new Haggadah, which the Caplan Center has been a sponsor of, and her brilliant writing and poetry will be front and center for us. So I'm going to stop my screen share and ask Eric if he wants to call on some folks to who want to ask questions or make comments about.
Yeah, if you have something that is on your mind, just kind of unmute yourself, and you can either direct, you know, if it's directed to me or to everyone else, or.
This is Bob Tabak. This is Bob Tabak in Philadelphia. Thanks,
Okay.
Eric. And I wanted to again say how grateful I am for this program. I'm glad that Dahlia Marks, who's the lead editor of the new Reform Siddur in Israel, Tefilat HaAdam, that just came out in 2021. She didn't ask me to do that. And if we need to make this conversation transatlantic, transcontinental, we need to bring on the editors of the liberal and reform Siddurim that have come out in recent decades in Britain. There are folks on the continent who are working on liturgy. There's certainly folks in Israel, not only in the major movements, reform and conservative, or Masorti, but independent groups like, and we need to have this conversation not focused solely on the United States and Canada, or even not on the United States, Canada, and Israel.
I'm not going to comment. Anyone else just wants to unmute and say something and contribute? Please do so. This is the informal part.
Eric, this is Jonah. I'm very grateful for this presentation of looking at the three movements prayer books together. And I'm hoping that you'll continue this conversation at some point, because I know you had a lot more to say on this issue, and I would really like to hear it.
All right. Well, we'll see. Well, when the preface comes out, we'll see if there's some stuff there that, you know, would make for another session. But I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
I second the request.
Well,
I just
leaving people wanting it, I think we have time for a few more comments.
Yeah, Dahlia was about to speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and it's just a little bit getting a little bit late, but I wanted to say thank you so much, Eric, for this presentation. I used your book a lot in my teaching, my writing, and I'm very happy that it comes out new. Your presentation was very interesting for me. It kept me thinking about a lot of things that are common for us here in Israel and things that are not. For example, the use of translation as a means to bridge a difficult text, or how you can deal with the translation. I just one comment. There are so many ideas, but just one thing. You were talking about. I think you said something like correct translation and I don't know if there is a thing such as a correct translation. A translation by definition is not correct, but it's not a scientific matter. It's a matter of art. You have you can translate a text in many ways, and this is something that I deal with a lot with my American students, and it's surprising how you can convey very different feelings from a text that from the original Hebrew text, that if you read the Hebrew, many different readings sort of appears simultaneously, but on the other hand, the difficulties in the text sort of are in your face and you cannot hide from them. Maybe that's why Israelis are not so keen on praying a lot. So I was just one thought of a lot of things. And Bob, Robert, Rabbi Tabak, thank you so much for your generous presentation of Tefilat HaAdam.
Yeah, I guess I totally agree with it. I've struggled, with the terminology, and I think I in the book I don't use correct for that exact same reason. But what I'm kind of referring to is, like, if you took a look at the So we didn't get to talk about like what happens to chosenness. So the idea in the Reform and the Conservative liturgies, the current ones of the American and Canadian conservative liturgies, so we see that the phrase, of Bechira is always translated in pretty literally, but what disappears is Romemanu Mikol Lashon. That does not get translated, or it gets translated in a way that is clearly trying to moderate the intent of the passage. So
Translate
that's the kind of thing that
for people.
those exalted us from amongst from amongst the people. So the Reform and the Conservative liturgists don't have any problem with the idea that the Jews are chosen, but they like to see this chosenness as being a chosenness among, and they don't like to view the chosenness as a chosenness above. So anytime the above kind of element gets in, the translation either avoids it or looks at it in a way that you would have to. It's hard to read the original Hebrew in that way. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I use. But I agree the term correct is not the most well-chosen term. David, you wanted to say something? Yes,
Yeah.
David.
Yeah, I just want to add to that notion about translation that inevitably all translation involves interpretation, and literal translation, a la say what you find in the Birnbaum Siddur, is actually less close, in my opinion, to providing the meaning of the Hebrew text than more figurative translation that attempts to get at the meaning in the Hebrew text. So if we think of translation as interpretive, that I think opens us to saying, well, okay, so within the frame of interpretation, what are the goals of the translator? And you were in this last instance driving toward that, Eric, I think, with your thinking about Romemu Mikol Halashon. But if we apply that to all of translation, I think it helps when we're doing comparative translation to understand what's going on. I think all too often the motivations of the translator are not speculated about, and then the comparisons don't really have much weight.
I would add that before we had the sophistication of translations and multiple prayer books, I was of a generation that had to find a simple way to deal with chosenness and change Mikol Ha'amim from all peoples to Im Kol Ha'amim with all peoples. And I still find that satisfying in a theological sense in some ways, though we have other formulations.
Though it's grammatically problematical in Hebrew.
Yes, it's true.
Anyone else? I think Marcia again, and then Jonah. Are you saying that you want to say? Oh, so Marcia and then Jonah.
I wanted to ask you, Eric, to clarify a bit more, if you could, the distinction you made between transvaluation and reevaluation. There was a point in your talk when you acknowledged that it wasn't clear what something was. I don't remember what it was, but it is a subtle distinction, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it has to do, and I saw, Catherine, that you had a comment in the chat about it about it as well. I think it's really a key point here, and you'll see that in the again in the Word document that I'll post with the recording. You'll see that I from the book that the Reform movement put out alongside their Machzor, There's a passage there from Janet Martyr, who's a co-editor, and another passage from Rabbi Morris, who's also a co-editor, talking about, why certain passages are back that were taken out from previous Reformed liturgies. So, for example, the Reformed Machzor, puts back Mashiach ben David Avdecha in the Messiah, the son of David, in a couple of places. And she says, well, we can put it back because we are open to saying that this can be understood in a multiplicity of ways, and it doesn't have to be understood literally as Mashiach ben David. We can understand it in different ways. And Rabbi Morris adds in and says, not only that, but he throws in the idea that Reformed Jews have gotten used to studying these texts and interacting with them in study groups, and they prefer to see them as they are instead of having them change. They would rather battle with the text than have some, some editor behind the curtain deciding that this has to go out, which is what I think, Catherine, what you were saying in part, if I understood it correctly. Caplan has a bit of a different perspective on this because, first of all, he's concerned that people see these formulations, do not realize that they're being reinterpreted, and come to synagogue and say, like, what kind of medieval people am I sitting with? Right? So he's not conceiving so much of, of a prayer book that has the kind of rich commentary in it that that the new prayer books have, as I showed you. But more than that, he believes that a text does have an original meaning to it.
Of course.
And that there is a limit to how far you can play with it.
No.
So like he says, in the introduction to the 1945 prayer book, to associate the idea that, our memories of a person live on after their death with the rabbinic conception of life after death is to read into the term something that is not in it. It is totally foreign to it. And it is a misrepresentation, and for him, that's a dishonesty, right? So that's what he talks about. Transvaluation is that kind of thing, is, in his view, reading into a text a meaning that was never intended in that text and could not have been intended because the person who wrote that text would have never thought in that way. While revaluation is finding in a text perhaps a meaning that was not blatant to the author, but was actually embedded in it originally. Now, as I was saying, and Marcia, you caught this idea, it's a very subtle thing to figure out when somebody is transvaluating and when somebody is
Isn't there a middle
revaluating.
ground? Isn't there a middle ground, Eric? Because we never know an author's intention. We never completely know what the rabbis thought and wanted. And this distinction partly reminds me of the literalists, the constitutionalists, who insist that we have to preserve what was at a time that's really not relevant today. You take the Bill of Rights, the second Bill of Rights, whatever it is, gun rights. I think that there is some middle ground between transvaluation and reevaluation, which is to say, you start with the source, of course. But the source has always, I believe, been interpreted metaphorically. I mean, much less so than today. But the metaphorical, the bringing out of the strands of meaning of the original text and then expanding it into our experience today is not dishonest, as long as you say what you're doing, of course. I mean, but it's not dishonest, and it's not, in the sense that you've just defined it, transvaluation. I think there's a combination of transvaluation and revaluation that's very important today.
Jonah?
Yeah, thank you. I'm new to this conversation. This is one of the first Caplan Center things I've been to, and only recently joined our board and ritual committee at West End. So I really appreciate the getting a chance to have some context for our prayer book and some of these discussions. In synagogue life, we're often stepping outside of the historical, because of course this is it's a script. It's the score. It's not the symphony. The symphony happens when we walk into services or get up in the morning and do our own morning prayers. And so I really appreciate the sensitivity to these as words that, in a way, what really matters is the person speaking, keva and kavana, sort of really basic concepts. The other thing I really appreciate is in this conversation, I often feel in our shul that everyone says, well, of course, we're Reconstructionists, so we believe this, X, Y, or Z. And calling out ideology versus the notion of practice and communication and something that happens beyond these separate fixed points. The last thing I'll say, and I'm sorry some of the folks left, I'm really struck that Kol HaNeshama is the oldest Siddur, and yet I find there are passages in it that are still forward-looking compared with the newer Reform and Conservative synagogues that you're calling out, the Shaviti and the guided meditations. We're now in a place where there's a lot of focus on prayer as a silent, meditative, contemplative activity, and not all these words. And it's sort of interesting to see. I feel like Kol HaNeshama has the space for things that we're still unpacking, whereas the other ones are making some room, but haven't looked as far as the folks working on Kol HaNeshama did.
Yeah, that last point that you made, I think, is right on, because one of the things that remains a unique defining characteristic of Kol HaNeshama is its openness to things such as guided meditations, and in the printed text, and kind of this shared kind of liturgical culture with Jewish renewal, in which these things even play a larger role than they do in Kol HaNeshama and perhaps in Reconstructionism. In the Reform movement, there's also liturgical experimentation, but they've kind of gone in a different way. Their liturgical experimentation is very much in the vein of the kind of mega churches. In other words, they've done a lot of work in putting together high energy renditions, music for prayers, and have like a full band set up like they do at their conventions, if you've seen the videos of it, and people jumping up and down and and responding to the text. And the other area where they've been, which I think also has its roots in the megachurches, where they've also been very creative, is with visual tefillah. Mm-hmm. And Reconstructionist communities, their experimentation hasn't really gone as much in those two directions. So I think that's kind of like a cultural difference between, as a whole, one movement over the other movement. Although we can all think of a synagogue that that takes one of these things and does it. So we're into heavy overtime now. Does anybody have anything else they would like to say, perhaps, before we close things off? Rabbi Chopper?
Yeah. The gates of prayer before Mishkan Tefillah had each one of those services had a certain theological assumption towards it. I mean, some more nature, some more history, some, what was it, heterodox, never an actual mention of God.
Yes.
Does the newer Reform prayer book, where they basically have an outline of the service, instead of having multiple services, they have an outline of the service, and each element you have any number of things you could choose. Do those options reflect these same theological
They do.
assumptions?
They do. And there's a conception that that the editors of the new prayer books talk about, where they talk about a multivocality. But what they didn't like, the Reform movement did a major survey of congregations before it redid its liturgy. And between 1994 and 1997, they did a massive research in the field. And they found that the approach to the gates of prayer, where you had, like you said, a service, a humanist service, and family service, etc., didn't work if you were, if you were coming to synagogue on a day where the rabbi decides to do the humanist service and you're not a human, and you don't define yourself that way, and suddenly God is absent or whatever, you're not satisfied with that. So as a result, they decided to opt for this design in which all the various different types of theological positions are placed on the same page. Now, not every page will reflect 3 or 4 theologies, but a service as a whole will reflect a multiplicity of theologies. And they thought that there was something, they grew to think that there was something very narcissistic in the structure of gates of prayer, that it kind of led people to think that you should go to prayer expecting to encounter there something that reflects you 100%. But rather, you should see your perspective within the umbrella of a congregation of multiple perspectives. And we're going to have all these perspectives, but now we're going to have them in one service. Sometimes you're going to find something that really speaks to you, and sometimes, it'll be something that speaks to your neighbor.
That sounds like peoplehood to me. Understanding that there's a range of possibilities when you gather the Jewish community together. I did want to quickly mention in response, Bob's no longer with us on the call, but I take his reminder that the Jewish civilization is not just North America and Israel, it's a world civilization. And for that reason, I am very excited that in April, around the time of Yom HaShoah, we've invited Dr. Jens Schwartz to talk about the amazing, unexpected resurgence of Yiddish in Sweden. We ought to be tracking the whole Jewish world and not the part of the Jewish world that we're simply most connected with. And Eric, you and I have to have a good discussion sometime about transvaluation, reevaluation, and Gadamer and other European phenomenologists' notion of the hermeneutic circle. Anyway, we'll have that discussion another time. But if you brought that up for me, I'm sure, look at all the things you brought up for the other folks on the call. So thank you so much.
Jeff,
Well, thanks. I so appreciate all the comments, and we started off with such a nice number, and so many of you have stayed. It's really been really a very meaningful to me to be able to share this work with you, to hear what you're thinking in response to it, and to be continued for sure. So
Thank you so
thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you so much.
Eric,
My
this is
pleasure.
really worthwhile. There are a lot of reasons why a lot of us have stayed on. Thank you so much for this. And
Thank
Jeff,
you
can
very
you
much.
send out those dates so we know?
Yeah, you will get multiple announcements about reminding you of the possibilities. It's on our master list, but we